Our third podcast is going to talk about issues related to populations that are socially rejected because of their gender, sexual orientation, or sex-related work, and what governments are doing about it.
Firstly, we would like to discuss barriers to women's reproductive and sexual health from a global socio-political standpoint. According to data, sexual and reproductive health extends beyond adequate access to healthcare and maternal support. The author contends that sexual and reproductive health also refers to an individual's ability to make decisions regarding their sexual activities, independent of external barriers like stigma and criminalisation. Date maintains that gender inequalities are a principal component of the sexual context of reproductive health, given that such inequalities impact women's reproductive decision-making. The reproductive and sexual rights of women were highlighted and advocated for following the International Conference on Population Development, ICPD, in 1994. Here, as part of the Programme of Action in Cairo, 179 countries advocated for global female sexual and reproductive independence. Particular consideration was given to the right of women to freely decide on their reproductive health, devoid of any discrimination.
Now, how does this international commitment manifest itself in reality?
In spite of rhetoric from the international community regarding advocacy for the right of women to avail of and maintain freedom over their sexuality health, many countries fail to adequately uphold and provide for adequate exercise of such right. The sexual autonomy of women is challenged by societal stigmas, has battered by gender inequalities, which negatively influence power relations between men and women in many countries. Grunskin and all discuss social cultural taboos has been embedded in legislation. These taboos often have negative effects on sexual health. Women's sexual independence in Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's particularly concerning. For instance, the percentage of women in relationship who feel they may ask their partner to wear a condom during intercourse differs substantially between regions in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dorte et al. Report that 93.4% of women in relationship in Namibia claimed that they could ask their partner to use a condom during intercourse, while only 16.6% of women in relationship in Mali felt has thought that they could do the same. Similarly, the proportion of women who felt empowered to refuse sex on their own terms in Namibia was reported to be 92.4%, while only 18.3% of women in Namibia claimed to be able to avail of such sexual and reproductive independence. Moreover, only 25.5% of Malian women reported being able to make at least one reproductive health decision, despite 97.2% of surveyed Namibian women reporting the same.
Aren't taboos and stigmas present in developed countries?
Societal norms, taboos, and stigmas are also apparent in the developed world. Cockrell et al. Reported that more than half of Americans between the age of 18 or over the age of 18 believe that having an abortion is morally wrong. 52% of women surveyed in the US admitted to believing that abortion should not be legal for women to avail of, where such women cannot afford more children. Such negative attitudes are associated with conservative beliefs regarding the life of the fetus, as well as women's sexual behaviour and position in society as caregivers. The link between religion, stigma, and legislative practice is apparent in the US, especially considering the recent US Supreme Court invalidation of the previous federal right to abortion, as per Roe v. Wade, 1973. Similarly, the relationship between religion and sexual independence in sub-Saharan Africa is apparent. Darta et al. Contend that Muslim women in sub-Saharan Africa are 0.39 times less likely to maintain power in determining whether or not to engage in intercourse, 0.3 times less likely to decide to use a condom during intercourse, and 0.29 times less likely to decide upon their reproductive health than their Christian counterparts. The author suggests that this lack of sexual and reproductive decision-making ability may be explained by inherent traditions, expectations, and stigmas within Islam. Darta et al. Justified this contention by referring to Islamic traditions regarding the submissiveness of women and dominance of men.
What effect does stigma have over legislation?
The institutional and judicial attitude towards sexual intercourse are intrinsically linked with social prejudice and stigma, as previously mentioned. For instance, the Irish legal system's interpretation of rape does not recognize rape in the traditional understanding as being possible to commit between female perpetrators and male victims. The Department of Justice publication entitled What Sexual Violence Is defines rape as an unlawful sexual intercourse with a woman who, at the time of intercourse, does not consent to it, where the man knows that she does not consent to the intercourse, or he is reckless as to whether she does or does not consent to it. For this purpose, men are excluded as possible victims of rape. In fact, the publication explicitly states that rape is only possible where vaginal intercourse occurs. Thus, rape is by definition only committed when a man has sexual intercourse with a woman without her consent. The same publication explains that rape may also occur where unconsensual penetration of the anus, mouth, or vagina is executed with the aid of any sexual object. This provision is established by Section 4 of the Criminal Justice Act of 1990. However, for the purposes of this provision, rape is satisfied where penetration occurs by way of an object. This excludes penetration with finger or genitals. In this regard, perpetrators of rape against men may escape adequate legal prosecution and punishment. Groskin maintains that rape laws that recognize only vaginal penetration by a penis as rape exclude many people from the spectrum of protection.
However, in many respects, LGBTQ+ individuals suffer from sexual repression and subjection more than any other community.
Well, Observatoire des Inégalités, a French studies center, showed in 2022 that participation in homosexual and LGBTQ+ sexual acts is prohibited by law in 69 countries. Many countries distinguish between same-sex and heterosexual intercourse in their legislation and judicial precedents. In some countries, same-sex intercourse in their legislation and sexual activities are prohibited by law due to the apparent indecent or immoral nature of such relations. This stigmatized, vague criminalisation of same-sex intercourse provides for judicial discretion, thereby leaving LGBTQ+ individuals to face subjective disposition within the courtroom. In other states, punishment for same-sex relations are much more severe, with certain countries outwardly criminalizing such acts. For instance, 11 states provide for the imposition of the death penalty against individuals who participate in private, consensual same-sex relations. Similarly, 14 countries criminalize the expression of transgender citizens via the improper and unjust application of law which prohibit the wearing of disguises or impersonation. On the other hand, some countries do not provide for legislation that prohibits LGBTQ+ relations and activities, yet the prosecution and mistreatment of LGBTQ+ individuals persists through the informal condemnation of LGBTQ+ belief and expression.
And this has consequences against LGBTQ+ communities.
Groskin and al. Discuss the criminalization of LGBTQ+ communities, both through formal legislation and informal stigmas. as a barrier to sexual pleasure, thus inhibiting sexual health and reproductive independence. In this sense, laws, policies, and customs surrounding sex, sexual health, and orientation are codependent and interconnected. For instance, a LGBTQ plus individual living in a country which criminalizes or stigmatizes.
Can you tell us more about the inner consequences of stigma in the LGBTQ plus community?
Grosken and al. Discuss the criminalization of LGBTQ plus communities, both through formal legislation and informal stigmas, as a barrier to sexual pleasures, thus inhibiting sexual health and reproductive independence. In this sense, laws, policies, and customs surrounding sex, sexual health, and orientation are codependent and interconnected. For instance, a LGBTQ plus individual living in a country which criminalizes or stigmatizes same-sex relations and LGBTQ plus expressions may be reluctant to avail of medical or reproductive assistance where such assistance may view their lifestyle unfavorably. Keynes and al. Suggest that some subgroups of the LGBT community are more likely to suffer from certain chronic conditions. This is exemplified by the fact that homosexual men in the US, despite representing only 2% of the US population, accounted for 61% of HIV and AIDS infections. 31% of homosexual men in the US are reportedly hesitant to seek access to medical care and are also less likely to discuss and or be tested for HIV with their primary physician. Similarly, STI rates are higher in LGBTQ plus individuals than in heterosexual individuals. Homosexual men account for 82% of new gonorrhea and primary and secondary syphilis cases. It is clear in this regard that LGBTQ plus individuals suffer unproportionately in comparison to their heterosexual counterparts. We contend that education plays an important part in appeasing otherwise hostile and inhospitable sentiments towards LGBTQ plus communities.
I think we covered some very important and broad topics today. That's a lot of information. But I think what is important to remember is to live without being judgmental and to think about what is best for yourself and for others. This can apply everywhere, and especially in the health sector. Shame is dangerous, and so is misinformation. We all have a responsibility to share knowledge and to make sure everyone can have access to sexual health care.